Greetings, everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about pediatric distal radius fracture. We all know that some greenstick fractures defy logic and seemingly displace. Is there a way of predicting these unstable fractures that slip? And how do you identify them? And what can you do to minimize the risk of slipping? A biomechanical classification of the fracture of the distal radius in immature skeleton was published by AO a few years ago. I do apologize, I am not able to pick that reference quickly. In essence, they classified the fractures into a torus fracture or a greenstick fracture, which they subdivided into two groups, or a displaced fracture. A completely displaced overlapping fracture with a bayonet apposition is eponymously called as quadratus fracture. The type of treatment one would recommend will depend on the type of fracture. For example, some simple fractures can be treated in splint. Typical example is a torus fracture, or a very minor greenstick fracture can be treated in a soft cast or a standard plaster. There is also a degree of debate between placing the limb in a below elbow plaster or an above elbow plaster. Some angulated or displaced fractures may require a manipulation and sometimes stabilization with KYS. Some quadratus fractures may require an open reduction because of soft tissue interposition. And generally in that circumstances, one would apply KYS to minimize the risk of displacement. This is an example of a torus fracture. It is essentially an incomplete fracture, and on two plain x-rays, you may be able to identify a breach in the cortical continuity, if at all, affecting only one quadrant of the circumference. You may not be able to identify fracture lines or trabecular line changes on the other quadrant. For example, on the lateral view, there is no change in the volar cortex, whereas there is a buckle on the dorsal cortex, which is also seen on the AP view. In the monogram, the greenstick fractures were subdivided into those in compression and those in tension. Those in tension seem to be heading more towards a displacing fracture. What are the difference between these two varieties? Let's have a closer look. We also need to know why it is important to distinguish between these two fractures. Compression fractures are relatively stable, whereas tension fractures are unstable and have a notorious reputation for slipping. Hence, in his pediatric childhood fracture textbook written by Mercer Rang, he called these fractures as slippers, not the Hawaiian type of slippers, a fracture that actually displaces easily. The distinction between a compression and tension fracture can only be made clearly on a lateral view. Here I have displayed two x-rays. The one on the left is a compression type fracture, and the one on the right is a tension type fracture. I will leave you to ponder on these two images for a moment to see whether you can identify the differences. When you looked at those two images, perhaps you picked up the difference between those two fractures. In a compression fracture, there is no gap on the volar side. There may be a simply plastic deformation only. The dorsal length may be a touch shorter than the volar length. Whereas on the tension type fractures, there is a gap on the volar cortex, and the dorsal length may be either same or slightly longer because the fracture is almost at the verge of starting to displace. This is a very key difference that you need to appreciate between these two types of fractures. In a schematic representation, I've tried to draw lines on a sketch of the fractures. The one at the top where I've marked A is less than B is a compression type fracture, and in the tension type, the length A is perhaps equal to or greater than B, and there is a gap between the cortices on the volar side.
Tension type fractures are highly likely to displace, especially when the elbow is not splintered due to the action of the brachioradialis. Brachioradialis is one of the very few muscles that spans between one end of the long bone to the other end of another long bone. In an unsplintered elbow, every time when the child bends and straightens the elbow, the passive pulling action of the brachioradialis can tug the distal radius fracture and is likely to accentuate the deformity further.
The next stage in the displacement is a fracture that is now disconnected both on the dorsal and the volar cortex, and the fracture is starting to move away. So you can now see um, asymmetrical gap between the volar cortices on the lateral view. These fractures are also potentially unstable unless they impact into the proximal spike. This is the next stage of displacement. Here you can see that the bone is starting to drift dorsally. One third of the volar bone is now exposed and is not in contact with the other side. And this, if the force continues, this would turn into a quadratus fracture. The final stage of continued force may result in a complete fracture because of the muscle pull. The distal radius sits on the dorsum of the distal fragment and overlaps. These are called quadratus fracture because the quadratus muscle is actually covering the distal fragment and potentially might work as a soft tissue interposition and prevent a closed reduction. Many of these fractures will require open reduction. However, in skilled hands, one may be able to reduce this closed. The focus of this POW is to apprise you of the difference between compression and tension type of greenstick fractures. Are there any evidences published? Yes, an unpublished series done by myself many years ago, where we looked at about 54 patients, pediatric distal radius injury. We try to distinguish between compression and tension fractures to see which one displaced more. We found that compression fractures hardly displaced, whereas the more than 50% of the tension fractures slipped. Most of these fractures were treated by a standard below elbow back slab and then converted to a full cast a few days later. There was not a lot of molding to counteract the potential risk of displacement. The quadratus fractures, many of them really slipped if they were treated purely with manipulation and plaster cast application, unless the cast was applied with 3-point molding with forearm in full pronation and wrist and palmar flexion. Best results with minimal slipping was seen in those that received K-wire fixation. So I would suggest that the management principles should be determined based on the type of fracture and its potential probability of slipping. A compression greenstick fracture can be treated in a well-molded cast and based on the age of the patient, the duration in the cast could be anywhere between 3 to 4 weeks. This may be followed with a wrist splint. Please be aware of potential tension type greenstick fracture, and if you suspect this, treat this in an above elbow cast with a very good 3-point molding. The cast index needs to be high. A cast should look more oval than circular, and remember what Charlie said, it takes a crooked plaster to get a straight bone. The forearm needs to be in pronation, and based on where the apex is, you may have to either rotate the wrist to pronation or supination to reduce the fracture. The cast needs to be kept for a minimum 3-week period, perhaps 4 weeks, and depending upon the age and the activity level of the child, a further 2 weeks of below elbow cast may be necessary.
My pearls of wisdom are: whenever you look at a greenstick type fracture, think. Think very carefully. Is it a tension type fracture or a compression type fracture? Whatever be the fracture type, apply a very good plaster with good molding which has got a high cast index. If it is a tension type fracture, it is vital that the position is rechecked at 1 week mark. Most importantly, please also inform the parents about the potential risk of displacement at the start of the treatment, including the need for a remanipulation and or a K-wire fixation.
The next few slides, I'm going to display X-rays, and I want you to shout out whether it is compression or tension. If I'm presenting this on YouTube, I will not be able to interact, so I will simply pause and allow you to make a call, and if necessary, people could pause the video before we move forward. So let's see how we concur with what is on the screen. Is this a compression fracture or a tension fracture? Is this one a compression fracture or a tension type greenstick fracture? What about this one? Is this a compression or a tension fracture? And this one, is this a compression fracture or a tension fracture? How about this one? Is this a compression or a tension fracture? Okay, how about this one? Is it a compression fracture or a tension fracture? One more for you. Is this a compression fracture or tension fracture? Would you be worried about this? And finally, is this a compression fracture or a tension fracture? If there has been huge difference of opinion, and if we are not able to really agree, then this calls for a simple audit. Perhaps we could do a study to identify which fractures display and see whether we can reverse engineer this to the classification. This might be a good exercise to do. It should be hopefully relatively simple, as this is radiological assessment. So if you are interested, get in touch with me. Let's see whether we can do a small project. Thank you for listening.